Welcome, everyone, to Alaska Quarterly Review's 2022-23 reading series. I am Ronald Spatz, Editor-in-Chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, and this event is being a recording and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Please feel free to watch any of our prior programs and to share them. Alaska Quarterly Review is committed to presenting these programs without charge and to showcase vibrant and diverse new and emerging voices and literary conversations with depth, complexity, and humanity. Like all literary magazines, AQR depends on grants, tax-exempt donations, and subscriptions to operate. If so inclined, donations and subscriptions are gratefully welcomed on AQR's website, aqreview.org. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgments. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and to the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is the Dena'ina homeland. The Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement toward decolonization and equity. Today's writers are ire'ne Lara Silva and Mai-lee Chai. Both are featured in AQR's Winter and Spring 2022 edition. Ire'ne's Song of the Burning Woman leads off our fiction section, while Mai-lee's Hungry Ghosts is a nonfiction essay, and that leads our nonfiction section. Mai-lee will be reading first, so the event will move from nonfiction to fiction. We will reserve a few minutes at the end for conversation. I will introduce each of our presenters today, right now, and we will introduce ire'ne first, and then Mai-lee, and then Mai-lee will simply begin, and ire'ne will follow at the conclusion of Mai-lee's reading. Ire'ne Lara Silva is an author of the short story collection Flesh to Bone, which won the Premio Atzlian Award. She has published 4 poetry collections: Furia, Blood Sugar Canto, Kakukali, House of Song, and First Poems. She has also published 2 poetry chapbooks, Enduring Azucares and Hibiscus Tacos. Her uncollected poetry, short stories, and essays have appeared in more than 70 journals and anthologies. ire'ne is also an editor, and along with poet Dan Vera, she edited Armenian poets writing in the Anzulan borderlands, a collection of poetry and essays. Among her recognitions, ire'ne was the recipient of a 2021 Tasajilo Writers Grant, a 2017 NALAC Fund for the Arts Grant, the Alfredo Cisneros del Moro Award, and was the fiction finalist for Raro's Gift of Freedom Award. In 2020, ire'ne was inducted as a member of the Texas Institute of Letters. Most recently, ire'ne was awarded the 2021 Texas Institute of Letters Shrake Award for the Best Short Nonfiction. ire'ne is currently a writer-at-large for Texas Highways Magazine and is working on a second collection of short stories entitled The Light of Your Body. Mai-lee Chai is the award-winning author of 11 books of fiction, nonfiction, and translation, including her 2022 short story collection, Tomorrow in Shanghai. The New York Times Book Review said of this collection, Chai has a remarkable skill for building tension, masterfully arranging all the pieces on the board to hook the reader. Also among her books are Useful Phrases for Immigrants, recipient of the American Book Award, and her family memoir, The Girl from Purple Mountain. Her writing has been awarded a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, Asian Pacific American Award for Literature, Gulf Coast Prize in Nonfiction, named a Kiriyama Prize Notable Book, and recipient of an honorable mention for the Gustavus Myers Center for the Study of Bigotry and Human Rights Book Awards. Her short prose has appeared widely, including in the New York Times, New England Review, Longreads, Paris Review Online, Los Angeles Times, and Small Best Fictions, and also cited twice as a notable book of the year in the Best American Essays. She is a board member of the National Book Circle Critics. Mai-lee, who says, if we don't tell our stories, we may never see ourselves represented, or else we may see our communities represented poorly through the lens of stereotypes or international conflicts or some other gaze that does not do justice to our complexity. So now to begin, I'll turn it over to you, Mai-lee.
Thank you so much, Ron, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you, Alaska Quarterly Review. It is an honor and thrill to be published in your pages, and thank you, ire'ne, Lara, Silva. It is Silva. Excuse me, ire'ne, Lara, Silva. It is an honor to be reading with you today. So I'm just going to read from the beginning of my essay, Hungry Ghost, and I'll read for just under 20 minutes. And since I'm reading from the beginning, you will see what the essay is about and how the themes of representation, personal experience, and community are addressed. Thank you very much. I am writing this in April, the month of the lunar calendar where Qingming falls, the festival for sweeping our ancestors' tombs, for lighting joss sticks and leaving offerings of food so our deceased will not become hungry ghosts, the spirits that roam the earth insatiable, their giant bellies always hungry. It is my haunted month, the month of my mother's birth and of her death. It is a month for personal beginnings and endings, the month when my memories of my mother's hunger, her pain, all that I tried and could not do to fill the hole gaping open inside her, spill out, are uncontainable, a wail. Once when I was in elementary school, I overheard the mother of my best friend complaining about me. She told my mother that she was very sad when our family moved to town and I started the same school as her daughter. Her older daughter had been denied a scholarship to college and instead an Asian girl had gotten one. My best friend's mother was certain this would happen to her second daughter now that I was here. I remember the silence in that moment while I stood in the hallway outside the kitchen, neither woman knowing I was there. I waited for my mother to defend me. I wanted her to say, my daughter is not causing anyone any problems, something to absolve me, or even to proclaim, Mai-lee works very hard. My mother said nothing. Shame lodged in my eye like a shard of glass. I was learning to read the world around me for my place in it as a young girl of color. Every anecdote, every slight, every silence was teaching me that I was not, nor would I ever be, the hero of my mother's narrative. My mother and I were not the same race. My mother was white, my father Chinese, and I mixed race Chinese American. I did not pass for white. My mother liked to complain when I was a child and later a teenager that she had been robbed of a scholarship because in high school a Hispanic girl had been awarded one instead of her. My mother considered this scholarship hers to win. A teacher had even congratulated her after the winner was announced. She probably voted for the wrong girl. She got her names confused, my mother wailed. Even as a child, I could tell there were holes in the story. Wasn't it a bad sign that my mother's teacher didn't know who she was and could mistake her name for another girl's, and one with a Hispanic surname at that? My mother's parents were highly unstable and moved their family frequently when my mother was growing up. But while my mother was able to tell me stories about her father's violence, her mother's angry enabling, she was never able to blame her parents' erratic choices for her lack of a scholarship or their refusal to pay for her education. Instead, my mother had learned to blame affirmative action for her scholarship loss, despite the fact that she graduated high school in 1951, 10 years before JFK signed the executive order that would begin affirmative action programs in America. It must have been less painful for my mother to tell this story and blame the other girl rather than her parents, who kept my mother out of class to clean their home, to watch her younger siblings, to pick up after the fights, the endless fighting. 20 years had passed since my mother hadn't gotten the scholarship from her high school when she first told me this story, but still she complained with a raw fury as though it had just occurred. I did not yet see how her anger would turn on me. When I was very little, I remember my mother praying on her glow-in-the-dark rosary. My brother and I climbed into my parents' big bed to wait for my father to come home from work. He often worked late at night, and my mother was afraid, waiting for him to return. I held the rosary card for her so that we could look up which of the 4 rosaries to meditate upon after each decade of Hail Marys. Her Catholic education had been interrupted because her parents moved around a lot. In the middle of the semester, 3 days from the end of school, a week after the start of the school year. Her father was an alcoholic, and they were always looking for a fresh start. My mother had had only 1 year in a Catholic school. My mother whispered in the dark, her fingers on the beads. Inspired with this confidence, I fly to thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions. My mother was the only Catholic in her family, a long line of staunch Protestants. She had converted when she was 13 after a nun saved her from schoolyard bullies. As a girl, my mother was impressed that a woman could be childless, educated, a teacher, in a position of authority, able to save a girl child from boys. As a child, my mother had been beaten, punched, slapped, starved, stung, kicked, worked, overworked, worked over, assaulted, insulted, harassed, touched against her will, slammed against a wall, struck with a fist, tooth knocked from her jaw. She forgave her parents 70 times, 7 times, again and again and again and again and again. She loved them wholeheartedly so that they might return the favor someday. She had been taught the only way to safety was silence, but lying next to her in the dark, I heard the way her breath caught in her throat. I remember the list: the joyful mysteries, the sorrowful mysteries, the glorious mysteries, the luminous mysteries. They alternated: joyful mysteries on Monday and Saturday, sorrowful Tuesday and Friday, glorious on Wednesday, and luminous on Thursday. Sunday we had church, so we didn't pray a rosary. The mysteries were groupings of moments in Jesus's life, but it was too complicated for me as a child to keep track of. Plus, I hated CCD and all the stories of suffering and guilt and pain. So I just say the words, the joyful mysteries, or the glorious mysteries, or whichever one I was supposed to be, and would leave it at that. My brother fell asleep, but I willed myself to stay awake, lying beside my mother, watching as the beads glowed bright white, then faded to green, then gray, then darkness, as my mother's voice whispered through the decades, seeking a miracle. Night after night after night, watching the moon rise and set bluely from the bedroom window, I wanted my mother to see my devotion to her. I wanted my mother to see how much I loved her. If my mother could see my love for her, I thought she'd love me too. I wanted my mother to side with me and not with the ghost. But her father had beaten his rules into her skin, punched them into her flesh, knocked patriarchy into her skull, rearranged her teeth to silence her tongue. When my mother opened her eyes, she saw the past, not me. She saw her father, always daddy, not her daughter, curled like a comma at her side. It was his love she sought, not mine. Unto the months before her death, my mother insisted that her father loved her, that the violence was accidental. Daddy didn't mean it, my mother said. Mother didn't know, or mother provoked him. When her father punched her in the face and knocked out her tooth when she was 17, when he punched her in the face when she was 9, when he tried to choke her mother to death and she had to run to the neighbor's house through the Indiana night and beg them to call the sheriff, when he told that joke in front of my father and brother and me about being called chink in the Navy and liking it because it was so funny, a white man being called chink because his eyes were so narrow. Get it? Daddy had a sense of humor. Daddy didn't mean it that way. When our family moved to a small town when I was 12, white kids in school called my brother and me names Chink and Jap and Gook and Chai Manchu and Flatface and Moonface and No Nose and on and on. I wanted the mother who used to take me for ice cream after school. I wanted a mother who took my side. But my mother said, just laugh along. Show them you can take a joke. Isn't this what her father had always said? What does it mean to side with a ghost? When she took my brother and me to visit her parents when I was 11, my brother 10, Gramps locked us outside their house while my mother had gone to buy groceries for Grandma. You brats are making too much noise, he shouted. And I shouted back, we weren't making any noise. We're not supposed to go outside. It's a high smog alert day. My little brother had asthma, but he kicked us out all the same. When hours later, my mother returned with Grandma and 4 bags of groceries, I told her what happened, and she said nothing. When I was growing up, my mother offered a million excuses for her father's violence, as though trying to find one that fit. He ran away from home at age 14, rode the rails with his best friend Charlie, started smoking and drinking. He didn't like his bourgeois parents' snobbery. They wanted him to go to school and become a dentist. A dentist, he roared. A dentist, my mother echoed. What's wrong with being a dentist? I'd ask as a child, my voice below the decibel audible to my mother's ears. He was forced to play the violin, which he hated. His mother locked him out of the house during the day so that she could clean. She didn't want a messy boy in her house. He enlisted at age 17. Although the military wouldn't send him overseas until he was 18, and by then World War I was over, his father, a veteran, enlisted as well so he could watch over his son, and the two were sent to France after the war to oversee reconstruction. My grandfather bragged to his daughter, this is where he'd learned his gourmet tastes. Decades later, he felt deeply ashamed when America entered a second world war against Germany. His mother's family was German. He didn't want to be related to the enemy, this other, this foreigner. He was proud of nothing so much as his deep American roots. He taught his oldest daughter to say, we're Dutch. She was 5 and had learned to speak German from her beloved grandmother when the U.S. entered the war. You speak Dutch, he corrected her. As a young man in his 20s, his addiction to alcohol deepened. He couldn't hold a job. He married a young German-American woman from a good family, and then she fled back to her family with her infant son, and her family refused to let him see her. They were as uptight and bourgeois as his mother. He got hammered and smashed out the window of his in-laws' furniture store, but they called the police and he spent the night in jail. My grandmother was still a child in elementary school, innocent of the violence swirling in her future husband's life. It was harder to find work after jail and the divorce. When he met my grandmother at a Prohibition-era party at his uncle's house, she was 17 and newly blonde, courtesy of a free bleach job given to her by her older sister to advertise the older sister's beauty parlor. The sister had recently married for the second time, an older man, my grandfather's uncle. My grandfather was smitten with the blonde teenager. He drank too much. He had to sleep in his uncle's house that night. He rose in the night, made his way to the blonde girl's bedroom, and had his way with her. 56 years later, after 50 years of marriage and 4 years after his death, my grandmother will say to me, he raped me, in the quiet of her living room as I dutifully take notes. In the sober aftermath, both families agreed he should marry the girl, make a decent woman out of her. Luckily, my grandmother did not get pregnant. She could at least say 56 years later, it was not a shotgun wedding. My grandmother said they had to wait a year for the marriage before the justice of the peace because she was 17 underage, her fiance 30. She wore a red velvet dress of her mother's taken in and repurposed for the occasion. I didn't know my charms, Grandma said. After my grandfather is married again, the chances for redemption are endless. He is a white, straight man married with 1, then 2, 3, 4, and finally 8 children. He is a veteran. He is and always has been exactly who the founding fathers intended to be a citizen of the United States of America. Every right is written with him in mind. Now, when something goes wrong, his wife is to blame. When I interviewed my grandmother about her life when I was 17, after my grandfather had died, Grandma said, When the sheriff's deputies brought him home, they'd say to me, "You should learn to keep a better eye on your husband, ma'am." When she spoke to the preacher about the drinking, about the violence, about the fear and the fatigue, the man said, "When you are married, you are like the yolk to the egg." The yolk to the egg, Grandma repeated. What does that even mean? Later, when Gramps found out Grandma had visited a lawyer, she said he told her, "If you leave me, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth, and then I will kill you and all the children." I believed him, Grandma said. "Oh, Mother," my mother said, sorrowful and small at Grandma's table. But later, on the drive home, my mother will say, "Mother provoked him." I remember the bedtime stories my mother used to tell us, the time she said she ran to the neighbors in the night, banging on their door and shouting, "My father is trying to kill my mother. My mother says, call the sheriff." And they said, "This is a matter between a man and his wife," and refused. I remember the time she said her father got drunk and cooked the family pets. And when she told her younger brother and sisters they didn't have to eat their rabbits, he grabbed her by the arm and punched her in the face hard enough to knock her tooth out. When Grandma drove her to the dentist said, "Next time, try not to be so clumsy, young lady." My mother invited my grandparents over after we moved to a farm in the Midwest. It was late April, after my mother's birthday, after the thick snows had finally melted and the mud in the fields mostly dried. The flowers my mother planted were finally beginning to bloom, tulips and daffodils, bright and cheerful. Gramps was 80 years of age with emphysema. He carried a small oxygen tank attached by plastic tubes to his nose. I was still afraid of him and kept my distance, but he couldn't walk the property. He hadn't the energy. He didn't yell at my brother or at me. More than 3 years sober, he'd become a genial man, content with the world. Gramps sat in the kitchen and looked out the window at the brome fields in the back. He dragged his oxygen tank to the front steps and surveyed the cottonwood trees on the neighboring property, the expanse of deep green grass sloping to the gravel road out front, all the dark fields stretching to the horizon as far as the eye could see. "You've really made it, Carolyn," he said. "I'm proud of you." It wasn't her college degree, first and only in the family, her publications as a journalist, her art, her teaching, her family, the chink, the brats. It was the farm, this American Gothic, that finally made Daddy proud. 3 months later, he was dead, and my mother, despondent, began to chase the love of his ghost. My mother fell into deep mourning. She'd joined a prayer group whose leaders believed that mixed-race people were a sign of the devil. Their children explained to my brother and me that we were a sign of the coming end times when Satan would rule on earth for 1,000 years. They believed that God had put the races on separate continents and only the devil wanted them to mix. Even as a child, I could see the flaws in the logic. Why then didn't white people stay in Europe? Why come to North America and take the land that God had given to the red race by their own reckoning? Because they did not like my brother and me, they did not want us at their meetings. My mother went alone. The white men who led the group told racist jokes about my brother, about me. When their children bullied us at school, my mother said nothing. When I confronted my mother with some new horror, she said to me sorrowfully, "I don't know why they have to be this way." Then look away, but she never stopped attending their prayer meetings. I think they reminded her of her father, the ghost who haunted her. He had liked to tell the same kind of jokes. He'd spouted the same kind of theories. Perhaps these jokes, these racist theories, made him feel powerful in a way that his addictions and his waywardness and his lack of control and his deep shame could not. Perhaps my mother could find no other way to fill the hollowness in her heart, the empty, gaping hole deep in her belly, except through these gatherings of white people who had suffered their father's rage in silence and sorrow. My father was asked to resign his job in that small town and had to work in another state. We couldn't sell our house, so we had to commute back and forth across the country. When he was home, he was tired. He slept or else he yelled at us, bitter at this turn in his life. White men drove by our house shooting. They killed our dogs, left their bodies in the driveway for my brother and me to find when we came home from school. When my mother called the sheriff's department, they did not come. When my mother had my brother and me post no hunting signs on our property, it did not stop the men from shooting. But we all knew these men were not hunters. Our dogs did not look like pheasants. Still, my mother could not call them racist. She spent more time with her prayer group. She left early in the evening to attend their meetings and returned late at night. My brother and I were often alone on the farm. My mother put my brother and me to work. She decided she wanted a working farm, the kind her father had always wanted. She bought at first several dozen chickens, then 300, then more than 1,000. She sold the meat and eggs to her prayer group at a loss. I was never paid. My days began before the sun rose and ended close to midnight. There was no running water inside the barn that my mother had built, so I had to carry buckets of water from our outdoor pump to the chickens inside. This took hours every day. Every Saturday, I spent 4 hours cleaning out the 360 gallons of liquid shit the chickens generated over the week. In the winter, there was no heat, and my skin cracked and bled. My hair began to fall out. I stopped menstruating. "You're so lucky," my mother said. "You don't get sick. When I was a child, I got sick. I nearly died. Mother nearly worked me to death." I thought, this is crazy, but I didn't know to think then when I was growing up, this is mentally ill. My mother put my brother to work in the appliance store that belonged to a member of her prayer group. My brother now delivered and installed refrigerators, stoves, insulation all over town. One day, the son of one of my brother's friends tried to kill my brother by pushing a refrigerator off the top of a flight of stairs on top of him. My brother survived by pushing the fridge up 2 flights of stairs until he reached a landing wide enough for him to get out from under the weight. His back was strained. After that, he was in constant pain. When my brother told us what happened that night at dinner, my mother looked away into the middle distance, a slight smile on her face, lost in some other memory, some other time. "He's racist. He calls Jeff Fu Man Chai in school," I shouted about the boy, trying to break through whatever ghostly spell my mother had fallen under. "He tried to kill Jeff." "He's just jealous," my mother said, then nothing more, her silence more haunting than words. So thank you very much. And now I'm going to turn over this time to ire'ne Silva. Thank you very much.
I want to start off by thanking Alaska Quarterly Review and Ron for the invitation. And Mai-lee, thank you so much for that really beautiful reading. It made me think a lot about my family as well, and the dangers of silence and violence, and even to the ways that love can be dangerous. The short story that I'm reading from today, Song of the Burning Woman, different territory, is a part of a short story collection that I'm working on, The Light of Your Body. It's a collection that's about desire, the importance of art, and tending to the wounds of history. And this collection, especially by history, I mean conquest, but even closer history as well. I don't like to tell a lot about the stories, but since y'all don't get to read the rest of it right now, I will just say that this is a pretty long story, and it's a collection of different voices that are telling something about their lives. And I'm just going to jump in. So here we go. Song of the Burning Woman, and I believe I'll have enough time to read y'all the first 3 sections. First person, Mai-lee. I said I'd grow the flowers myself, and I did, from seed. Now here they were, blooming everywhere, and every shade from lemon yellow to gold to orange to dusky red, solid and striped, some the sizes of bushes, others fit wholly in my hand with the roots lying on my wrist. Every variation I've been able to find, African, French, signet, tangerine scented, Spanish tarragon, Irish lace. The idea came to me last year when I was taking down my Day of the Dead altar. I hadn't built such an elaborate one in decades, but the silence and the isolation had seemed to call for it. No one had thought we'd still be social distancing last November. I don't count the months anymore. I only remember it was a March when the world moved from one kind of time to another, one kind of space to another, one understanding of death to another. And the days and the months and the years were like an accordion, flexing this way and that, speeding up and then slowing down. People got sick, people got better, people died. It was a weird thing at first to be a woman without family in a pandemic. I never knew my father. My mother died when I was in my 20s. No brothers, no sisters, no close cousins, no connections to elderly aunts or uncles. All those connections long gone. Left behind when I decided that neither hiding nor judgment were for me. I didn't know if they lived or died. Even before the pandemic, I'd sometimes search online for their names and add the word obituary. As the years passed, there were fewer names to search. I made my arrangements years ago, before I retired. Went to the funeral home and laid everything out, paid for everything. My friend Jose said he'll deal with all my art and Sol will take care of everything else. I'll leave no chaos behind me. Maybe my friends will gather, wish me well in the afterlife, pour a little tequila on the ground for me. I've always loved the parties, loved the music and the colors and the people and their joy and the dancing and the food and the drinks. Loved the planning and the inviting and the way time ran swiftly at the start and then slowed syrup slow in the later hours. Loved those molten hours before dawn when only close friends remained and the brightness of the night glowed like an ember in my chest. I always loved my own parties best because hosting kept me busy when melancholy threatened. Because if I needed to escape, I forgave myself the need to make excuses. I used to love dancing. When I was young, I could dance for hours, flinging myself from one partner to another, or dancing by myself, or as part of a vast, faceless crowd. I never cared if someone was watching. Hell, sometimes I wanted everyone to watch. It never mattered to me as long as the beat compelled my body. When I grew older and one injury after another froze up my joints, the singing became everything. I'd sing until my voice turned to gravel, until it seemed my voice could fill the entire room, until everyone was singing with me, until I'd emptied out all the lyrics that lived in me. It didn't matter to me if I could sing or not, or if other people were off key. What mattered was that we sang together. My house is a little house, nothing special to anyone but me. Corner lot, 8-foot wooden fence for the backyard that I put in for my ex because she used to lie out naked whenever the sun was shining, like a pinche lagartija trying to get her cold-blooded heart pumping again. She left me 3 years ago. No fights, no arguments. She was just done with me. I finally got all her stuff out of the shed behind the house. I took anything someone could still use to the battered women's shelter, tossed the rest of it. I didn't burn it like my dramatic heart wanted, but at least it's gone now. Next time she thinks to call or text me and promises to come pick it all up, I'll tell her, nah, don't worry about it. It's gone. And she won't believe it. I know what she'll say, that I'm trying to make her hop on a plane and come see me, that I still want her back. She'll say it's because I never stopped loving her, that she knows she broke my heart and that I'll never be able to love anyone else again. But that's a lie. Only I know my capacity to love, and there's enough left for someone else. Enough love left for one more great love, or maybe 3 little ones. Even though my hair is gray, even though I've been retired for 10 years, even though my body is wrinkled and sagging and plump and scarred, but none of those things diminish me. I am more now than I have ever been. It felt a bit odd to plan for a party again. I was cautious beyond cautious, wading through pandemic waves, years without drawing up lists and planning out the space and thinking of what I needed to build and who to invite. But even my cautious heart didn't want to wait anymore. It was time for a party, a small and lovely and long party with talk and food and singing and dancing and art and photos. I asked Nora to make us tacos, and Sol brought pan dulce and a huge pot of caldo. Jose volunteered to make drinks. I stocked up on chorizo, bacon, eggs, potatoes, and flour tortillas for whoever's still here at breakfast time. I cleaned and cleaned until not a speck of dust remained. I set up stations in the backyard, 6 large ones, 7 small ones. Built them myself. They're not fancy, plywood and 2x4s, hammered together with nails and prayers. And then I invited my friends to make altars of them. I grew all the marigolds in anticipation of today. Marigolds along the fences in the house, marigolds around the trees, marigolds along the sidewalks, and marigolds bursting from my lady, my marigold lady. Lady Cempasúchil. What else can I call her? She's a little bit of one thing, a little bit of another. Multi-hued marigolds bursting from her earthen flesh. A little Xochiquetzal, the goddess of flowers and art. A little bit of me. Sometimes, somehow, she has my mother's eyes. I built her 13 feet tall. You can feel her serene gaze from every corner of the backyard. Pati. Ay, mira, it's been 29 years and she still built an altar for me. That same photo in a silver frame, que bonito. And my favorite peonies without stems on the lace tablecloth. The first time I held a peony in my hands, I told Emma Lisa they reminded me of the plump bodies of doves, soft, round, feathered, and look, a plateful of tamales, chicken with salsa verde, each tamal tied with a little strip of corn husk, like an extra blessing, like little gifts. They're even still steaming. And a little shot glass with tequila and a cup of my favorite coffee, that fancy coffee she would special order for me that tasted like coconut. I see the big flower lady in the middle of the backyard. There's nowhere you can be that she can't see you. I like the cempasúchil, but mostly I just see chichis and nalgas and flowers coming out of her, what you call it. Emma Elisa says, yonis. I used to ask her all the time why she made so many naked lady statues with breasts and yonis. And she would say, ama. It's about a woman's eyes seeing a woman. It's about the desires of women, los deseos de mujeres. And I would say, okay, but make me something else. I don't need woman parts on necklaces or earrings or keychains, mija. How about flowers or the sun and the moon? My poor Emma Lisa, all alone. Some years she has someone, but most years she's alone. I wish I'd been able to give her some sisters and brothers, but she was my only. I didn't tell the doctors they could cut me, but they did. I was only 19, went to the hospital alone, no insurance. The doctor said I was signing for painkillers. My mother said it was probably for the best because I fell in love and I fell in love and I fell in love and none of them ever stayed. She said those lying doctors were a blessing in disguise where I would have had 20 kids with 20 different fathers. She'd already raised me and my sisters. She said she didn't want to raise her grandchildren too. She never understood me. I just wanted somewhere to belong. I wanted someone to hold me and make me real. I wanted to make a home, a warm, pretty place that didn't smell like bleach and fried potatoes. I wanted a man to put his arms around my shoulders, to put his hand on the small of my back, to keep me warm and weigh me down and fill me and exhaust me. I wanted a home filled with laughter and kisses and affectionate touches. The men came and went, but mostly it was just me and Emma Lisa. So I filled our home with flowers and leafing things, bought us a color TV and soft furniture that I never covered in plastic. Emma Lisa liked to draw and make things, so I bought her a few things every week: crayons, watercolors, construction paper, Play-Doh. I worked part-time as a cashier at a grocery store and picked up shifts at the Mexican restaurant a few blocks away. I tried not to leave Emma Lisa with my mother too often. She always came back too quiet and sometimes with tear tracks on her face. My best friend Mari had 4 kids and was a housewife, so mostly Emma Lisa ended up over there. When she got older, she helped care for the little ones, drawing them pictures and keeping them out of trouble. She was always independent. By the time she was 12, she'd cook herself dinner and do her homework without my having to tell her anything. When she was 16, she told me she liked boys. When she was 16, she told me she liked girls, not boys. I'd just woken up and was still wiping the sleep out of my eyes. She said it low, a little nervous, with a look in her eyes like she thought I might hit her or like she might cry. I'd never struck her or even spanked her because I never wanted to be like my mother. I pulled the blanket back and held my arms out to her. She made a little cry, and I held her the way I'd held her when she was a little girl and afraid to sleep when there was thunder. I kissed her temple. It's okay, Mika, it's okay. You can love, whoever you want to love. And she cried just a few tears because my Mai-lee was always strong like that. It took me a few minutes, though, before I thought to tell her that it would probably be best not to say anything to her grandmother. I was dating Ruben then. I thought he was going to be the one. He stuck around for a while, but then he left too. And then there was Frankie and Joel. And Mai-lee went to the community college for a couple years and then moved to Austin to go to UT. David used to take me up there to go see her every other month, take us out to a nice dinner, and to go see some of his buddies playing live music here and there. Before Mai-lee graduated, she introduced me to her girlfriend Lisa and said she was following her back to San Francisco. By then, David was gone and I was seeing Michael. We flew out once to see Mai-lee in California, and once she took the Greyhound to come spend a few weeks with me here. And then I met Elias, and he really was the one. He got down on his knee to propose, and I wore his ring. We set a date and picked a cake and sent out invitations, and even Mama liked him. But then that day came. We were going out for lunch to that little taqueria we both liked so much on North 10th with Street, with the tacos de trompo and the baked potatoes and the good lemonade. He was kissing my hand and I was looking at him, and neither of us saw the truck that ran the red light. We never got to promise each other till death do us part, but it was okay because we'd already promised each other forever and forever, and that's what it's been. 2 years together in life, 29 together in the afterlife. He's visiting his brother's family right now, but he'll be here before long, and he'll take my hand and bring it up to his lips to kiss it, and he'll say my name and smile. Jose. It's an art. I told Emma we weren't going to have that margarita mixture from H-E-B. I brought all of my own bottles and ingredients, enough Patron silver to float us all away. My own syrups and fruit blends and garnishes. I had 26 specialties, one for every year Ismael and I were together. I didn't know it was going to become a tradition. That first year, I invented El Mango Tango Wango Margarita and served it to him with chorizo and papa taquitos in bed while singing No Tengo Dinero at the top of my lungs. That went over so well. The next year, he got El Tierno Corazón de Melón Margarita with green salsa chilaquiles and Amor Eterno. The last time we celebrated an anniversary, he could barely eat or drink, but he sipped my Tulipan Tintan Te Quiero Mucho Margarita while I serenaded him with Yo no vivo por vivir. At the time, I didn't know how little time was left. The oncologist had estimated a few more months, but it was only a few weeks. This is my first Dia de los Muertos without him. And Mai-lee told me I could have one of the big altares, so I could do one of the big mixed media art and music installations I was known for. But that was my work. And I didn't want to make anything that would be photographed and cataloged and written about. I didn't want to answer questions in the future about how important Ismael had been to me or what reaction grief transmuted into art should evoke in the viewer. I just wanted to remember Ismael. So I told her the kitchen counter would be all the altar I'd need. Elisa had a ton of marigold bouquets and tall white candles all over the kitchen. I'd printed up a pretty little menu with all the drinks. And though they weren't expecting it, everybody got a little bit of a song with the drinks. No Te Agüites Aguacate Margarita was served up with lyrics from El Noa Noa. The Cucurucu Coconut Margarita with Querida, and La Fresa Triste y Linda Margarita with La Diferencia. The last one almost made me break into tears, but then again, rancheras are supposed to make you do that. So if my voice wobbled, it wasn't more than anyone expected. I lost track of how many drinks I made, how many times the blender whirred, how many oranges, pineapples, strawberries, limes, mangoes, and avocados moved through my hands. I spent my breaks eating the tiny little tacos Nora was making in the backyard with fajitas, cebolla asada, cilantro, and lime. I'd have a corona and then go toward the altars as they were being built. I restrained myself mightily as I saw people struggling with color coordination in their arrangements. I reminded myself that love has its own aesthetic, that they would all look beautiful by the time they were done. If nothing else, we could always add more marigolds. When Elisa wasn't looking in my direction, I'd grab a quick marigold bloom and eat it. When we first saw a monsoon wedding years ago, it awoke a ferocious hunger in me for marigolds. I won't eat the ones from florists because I know they're full of chemicals, but I can never resist them when I see the edible flower petals at the grocery store or when I saw them in people's yards. They taste a little smoky, a little spicy, a little bit like a single paint stroke of sunlight on the tongue. There was a quiet hour, just as the sun was going down, when everyone was busy finishing the last details of their altares, laying down flowers and food and photos, and candles were being lit everywhere. 12-day candles of multicolored glass, patron saints everywhere, the Virgen de Guadalupe and the Virgen de San Juan vastly outnumbering everything else. Elisa was everywhere, handing out little ceramic plates and saucers in an effort to cut down the risk of everything exploding and catching fire and burning her house down to the ground. I don't know what it was, but an impulse seized me, and I took advantage of Mayra's arrival to uproot an entire bush of pretty striped marigolds that were growing in the backyard. Elisa never saw me since she was busy directing the lighting of the 2-foot-tall beeswax candles Mayra had brought all around the lady. I plucked a pile of the deep green leaves and then pulled the petals free by the handful. I rinsed them and put them into 2 glass bowls with ice water. Under my breath, I started singing, and it took me a few lines to realize it was a chorus from Juan Siempre en mi mente. Orange and grapefruit and lemon and lime and generous handfuls of marigold petals, and this and that went into the blender. I was this close to pouring in some of the tequila when I suddenly thought of the 3 bottles of mezcal I'd brought to drink with Elisa and Kimberly. We always had mezcal when we were together, a tradition dating back to when we'd all been young artists in San Francisco. I brought 3 bottles of the Maguey Vida mezcal. I planned for us to drink one by morning and to give them the other 2, but I couldn't resist. Its smokiness would complement the marigolds like nothing else. How to explain what happened with that first sip? That feeling I felt, like there was a small candle burning bright in my chest, and its glow was growing and growing. I sang louder and louder, and I didn't even know I knew all the words to the song. I thought of how much Ismael would have loved this gathering, how he would have taken up a spot close to the lady and strummed his guitar, breaking into song throughout the whole night. How he would have come to the kitchen to see what I was making and then laugh when I'd catch him stealing my fruit garnishes. How he would have wrapped his arms around my waist and leaned in close to press a kiss behind my left ear. And I thought for a moment I could see his reflection in the kitchen window and feel his beard stubble on my neck. And I thought perhaps he hadn't really left me all alone. I salted the glasses and poured in the golden mixture and sipped it, and for a moment tasted his lips again. And I sighed and named it, the Cempasúchil Siempre Margarita. Thank you.
Wow, that was wonderful. So, when we had your essay, Mai-lee, and your story, ire'ne, come to us, they were showstoppers. We had thousands of prose pieces, and they rose up. And I wondered if we could just start a little conversation. And if you don't like this question, you can kind of morph it into something else. But I just wonder about how important the lens is that you use when you communicate about your communities, about the things that potentially are really important. Because for us, that came through very strongly as something that engaged us and is compelling. So I wonder if you could discuss that a little bit or talk about it or ask each other some questions about, what do you feel kind of motivates you to actually tell the story? And, you're included in Alaska Quarterly Review's pages, but there's a very powerful inclusion in your work, separate from being included with the work of others. And so I just wondered if we could just start off with that and move wherever it goes for a few minutes.
I just want to say how deeply moved I am by ire'ne's story and reading. It was so beautiful, and the language is so beautiful. And I wrote down lines like the days and months and years were like an accordion. The taste like a single brush stroke, a single paint stroke of the sun on the tongue. And then the idea of the woman saying that, I still have enough left in me for one great love or three little loves. I love that so much. And I find I found your reading so beautiful.
Thank you so much for that. This actually is a story that kind of had stayed with me for a long time, but it took a while before I could figure out how to voice it. And part of that was, how we were talking a little bit earlier about, the idea of what gaze we write for. And one of the things that I've thought about for, decades now, Toni Morrison's view of the white gaze and whether or not we're writing for the white gaze or not. And I actually just wrote something about Indigenous futurism that had to do with Toni Morrison and the white gaze. And it was a few years ago that in conversation, it occurred that it was, it's seen so much as a topic or an issue that has to do with who is being written, who we're doing the writing for, who the audience is or who the market is. But in this conversation that I was having with someone, part of what occurred to me was that, yes, that's part of it. But the other part of it is that writing for a white gaze assumes different relationships. It assumes things about what stories can be told. It assumes things about relationships between people and nature, people and each other. It assumes relationships about people and time and nature, animals and nature, all these other different things that can shape our stories. And there's so often places where it feels like you have to go against the idea of what we're taught a story is in order to be able to tell the story we need to tell. And so I think a lot oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and that is where the silence comes in, right? If I think about if my piece is about anything, it's about fighting that silence and speaking up and to not be silenced. And I think about the white gaze for so many of us is about silence. We don't have a voice in that. We can't tell our stories if that's who we're telling our stories for, if that's who's judging the story, if that's the only story that can be told. I know that story. I've learned it from my mother and my grandmother. They lived that story and it was hell. Right. So I feel like that's, the reason I speak up in the way that I do is because I know the hell of that silence. And I just feel like your story also is like, you've centered this community, you've centered your community, and it's filled with love. It does not have to be filled with silence. And I think this is, I think that this is empowering to think about. It's like, if we don't, we don't have to think about dismantling that other right now, in every story, but we can think about if we tell and center our stories, we are dismantling the silence. We're speaking into that void.
And then also you can have, part of the, like I said, part of the project that I've been taking on with the writing is not necessarily healing, but tending to, the wounds of history. And, how do you do that without changing how you see the relationship between a person and time, a person and reality, a person and history? Not so much that it's, we use the phrase, revisionist history. You also hear that, a lot of it's about complicating history or, telling the parts of it that haven't been told, which is a lot of it. This story goes on to, include many other voices, and it includes, different people from different time eras that are talking about queer identity or different gender identities even. And, and it's about that, like, how do we make, and not even create, how do we write from and create the stories, whether it's, poetry or fiction or nonfiction, that can tend to those wounds. That's part of what's happening when we, speak everything that's been silent. You can't tend to a wound until you acknowledge the wound is there. You can't tend to it until you fully describe what has happened. You can't tend to it without a vision of what it should look like when it's healed, or a dream for it being healed. And that's, I think, so much of what makes or what can make writing powerful.
I
You know,
love how in your story, you also create this expansive notion of the world and possibilities, and that is outside of that kind of white colonizing gaze. For
Mm.
example, the woman who's talking about the 29 years in the afterlife, right? They've had this relationship and 29 more years, right? It didn't end at that day of that horrible accident. It has continued and the relationship continues. I think that sense of time is really important. And I think that pushing against the idea that, oh, well, the past is past and now we move on because that's another way of silencing, right? Oh, but no, we're still in dialogue with the ancestors. We're still in dialogue with these communities. We have to have a more expansive notion of time. And then we can, start the healing. But if we're told, oh, no, that's over, there's nothing more that can be done, then we've already been told there's no point in trying to speak at all.
Exactly. You see, and that was one of the things that I really keyed into with your work, this idea of the hungry ghost, because that is a relationship that continues. That my mother passed away 21 years ago. And I tell people, I think she taught me how to mourn her by demonstrating how she mourned her mother. And her mother died before I was born, so I never met my grandmother. But my mother constantly, I think almost every day, what my grandmother liked to eat, what she said, a certain proverb, a thing she wore, a place she went, a memory she had. So it was like I grew up knowing that grandmother without ever having met her. And I've seen in my life how in the last 20 years, I constantly remember my mother, something she cooked, something she said, something she did, something she thought, a joke she would tell, an advice she would say. All of these things are always in my mind. And, and that, I think that also is powerful when it comes to with different cultures, how we see what the relationship is between life and death, between this life and the afterlife. And sometimes in ways that, mainstream society can't accept, or that I love the movie Coco. It made me cry like everybody else. But part of me also felt like it was sort of kitschy, and it was, it was framed a certain way. It was framed for, marketable consumption. And it didn't speak very much to, what the daily life is like, what our daily relationship is to the dead. And
it says of obligation to the dead, right? The mutual obligation to the dead and to the dead to the living. It's a web. And I feel like it goes along with the erasure of history if we erase, these ties. And the idea of how spirituality has been shaped by empire, right? It is to conquer us, it's to conquer the land, is to conquer the people, and each group that's been conquered is then absorbed into this religion of empire. And it's hard to unpack. I find like it's hard to unpack. I spent a lot of time thinking about how to unpack this, how to describe this. I don't want to, exotify. I want to write into this space, which gives me space and time. And I find there's so much propaganda against it. Everything in our culture, it's so heavy in the silencing. And so it took a lot of effort to try to find the spaces to write into and to make my space. And so I felt like I don't know how long it's taken you to write these stories, but it just felt like it moved so smoothly into this space when you were reading.
It took forever. It took a really long time. It took forever, and it takes forever. But I think that's, when we talk about empire and we talk about propaganda and we talk about the rewriting of history and, this current, offense that's been mounted against critical race theory and against, history, so much of it has to do with, in order to create, or not to create, but to create and to cementify what people want to establish as, truth and reality and what's fair and what's not. So much is about making people forget what happened before. This whole huge effort to, what's the language they're using? Instead of saying that people were slaves or that there were enslaved peoples, to try to call them indentured servants, or to try to completely change the framework of what happened in order to tell a different story and justify and you know, in an effort to justify current injustices and violences. I mean, it's insane the war that's been waged with how you tell stories. And so I think on our part, you know, when people ask, you know, what is the, well, that's one of the activist things of writers, is to go back and tell the truth and go back and recover these things that we don't think are real, and to make things that would otherwise just be sort of little, you know, factual bits, to make them into living stories, you know, what people actually lived, whether it's in nonfiction or these fictional stories of realities that people have lived.
And I feel like you had mentioned this earlier, but I
Mhm.
also feel like within like the way stories are allowed to be told and what's considered a story and what's considered history and what's legitimate, I think of the stories that are passed down from our mothers,
Yeah.
right? Women have been written out of so much of history by design. And so then women tell stories, they tell stories to their children, they pass down these stories. Then what, well, that's, you know, it's a gift and it's a burden. What do I do with this story? And one of the things I was thinking, I've been working on this for years, this essay, and then, oh my God, the horror has happened. Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Mm.
And I mean, my grandmother's story is from an era before, you know, pre-Roe v. Wade America. And that was a brutal era for her and her, you know, and to be a woman and to be impregnated so many times. And then to think about, you know, you're always to blame. The woman is always to blame. And that, you know, she has to be made into a decent woman by marrying her rapist. And I think we are, like, it felt when I was growing up, this was a long time ago. These values are from a long time ago. And yet they're always just below the surface. And here we are right back again. And it's terrifying to see how swiftly we forget. It's terrifying to see how quickly these stories are, you know, actively being erased. And if you see like all the movements now to, you know, ban books all across the country, it doesn't matter how small the town, how small the library, there's a movement to ban the books, to stop the storytelling, to stop the drag queen storytelling, to stop all these moments of joy in telling stories. And I know Alaska Quarterly Review, you've had to fight to keep, you know, the journal alive, right? Because there's a constant attack on these places, these spaces where we can tell our stories.
Yeah, and part of that has to do with a notion and a narrative that the arts are tangential, they're a luxury, they're for entertainment primarily. And the problem with that is, and this is the real pressure in our society, and more in America than in other places, in civilized countries, the capitalist view, let the market decide. And the market is skewed against what you both are talking about.
Well, the market is a tool of empire, right?
Exactly.
I mean, we say it's the market. They say that market is neutral. The market is not neutral. How does someone get a $44 billion loan, right?
Exactly.
To buy something up that other people use and then control it, where, you know, the rest of us, you know, we have to struggle to get, you know, to qualify for a mortgage, to keep our, you know, to keep our credit at a certain level so you can get, you know, more credit to buy groceries or something. I mean, the market is not neutral. And, you know, and so I see the propaganda all the time, and I just feel like I've got to shout louder and louder and louder against it, but it is exhausting.
Yeah.
And that's what, you know, and that's what the market and the whole goal of propaganda, it turns everything into products. It turns everything into consumables. I mean, a lot of what I talked about with my last poetry book with Gustavus House of Song was how often we see songs as something to be consumed, something to be bought, something to be on, you know, best lists and to be on, you know, platinum record deals, things like that. And we don't think about song or art as having a spiritual value, having an emotional, psychological, communal value. You know, the ways that we don't, you know, the market doesn't talk about the ways that art saves us, you know, and whether it's in schools, whether it's in public libraries, whether it's in journals, whether it's, you know, at readings or at festivals, at these different events, all the ways that they save us and they keep us. I mean, that's not something that the market cares about, or rather, it's something that they actively work against.
Yes, that's what I
Because
think. They know
they
art
know,
saves us, but
yeah.
they don't, but we're not the us that they want to have saved.
But if people are saved, then they're not going to go spend all their money, you know, trying to go buy the things that they're marketing. because
if-
then they'd be busy creating instead of consuming. Mhm.
And if little kids in public school, right, if they have art and they know how to tell their stories and they can be in communion with their communities, they can form a resistance because
Well,
it's
yeah,
very empowering.
yeah. It's also it's not even always about a resistance. It's like you talked about silence. It's simply about having a holistic and a sense of well-being in
Mhm.
society. And narrative is essential to well-being.
Mhm.
Okay? But the problem is, and as we get into a more dark place in our country right now and in the world, the problem is the narrative is not free, if you follow what I'm saying. And it's been true forever that the artists are not allowed to speak. The ones who are trying to get to where does the truth come from? Well, it comes from the lens that people have. It comes from their identity, who they are. And if they are really trying to seek the truth and tell it as they see it, as opposed to a prepackaged political kind of statement. And in totalitarian countries, whether they are capitalist or communist or whatever, you notice there is an absolute oppression of artists. I mean, they are the artists are often the first people to be silenced because they're very dangerous. Art is incredibly dangerous.
But sometimes, it's not
funding-
even, we tend to jump to the idea of political repression or writers, and there, of course, are countries where writers are being, taken and imprisoned and all this. But there was an interesting article a few years back, and I was thinking, this is one of the ways when we talk about who gets to tell the stories and which writers are we seeing and hearing or listening to, and that article had to do with how impossible it almost is for writers who are not from an upper middle class or other classes that are able to sustain even a writing career, that it's difficult for them to write and much less get published, much less have their work advertised or seen widely. And and that's one of the first ways, if you can't afford to live while you're trying to make your art, that cuts out a lot of different voices and a lot of different possibilities.
You think about
And
the
then
publishing industry is set
exactly.
up that way by design. Who gets
Mhm.
to be the editor? Who gets to make these choices? People who can afford to live in New York City on what, on an unpaid internship or $35,000 a year. That's somebody who's got access to housing. That's somebody who's got a spouse with a large salary, or it's somebody who's going to work extra jobs. And then there's a point when you just get, your body wears out and you can't keep
Year
doing
after year, decade after decade of trying to work on your art and put your work out there.
Yeah.
And and then also too on the end of again going back to publishing, who is being published, who do the writers and who do the editors and the different publishers think, what work do they think is going to sell, rather than what work or art is important and needs to be heard.
Right. And that's why the literary journals build the scaffolding that is essential to the fabric of the literature and of the identity of where we are and who we are. And so the problem is that there is a reductionist kind of view from the market, right? And the democracy, let's just say, of the literary journals. I mean, there are no ticker tape parades for the literary magazines. Okay, I mean, we do it because we think at Alaska Quarterly, in fact, we don't think, we know that it is essential. And it's essential that we stay true to the mission. Exactly, to have the inclusion that leads to finding truth in all of its parts, that seeking of it. That's what's advanced on the good side of humanity. That's where it comes from. And in enlightened societies in the world, the arts and the literary arts are much more significantly funded. You don't have to worry in the same way about who is the publisher and who gets to see it. So even if the person can't afford to do, it's not only their, an issue of personal poverty, it's a question that it's very hard to get a venue to be heard. That's why we're doing our YouTube channel and bringing together so many, honestly, because even with our journal and even with kudos that we get from time to time, we need to expand that connection between writers and readers. We need to make the pie bigger, even though we're little. We have to pry open ways to make those connections. That's not what's happening in the more corporate view, let's just say. The corporate view is finding where is the sales, what is going to drive that. And in fact,
they create the sales. I really feel, I feel like there's also, it's not even just who gets the sales, because if you saw the, on Twitter back in the day, publishing so white, the hashtags, best-selling authors of color weren't getting the same advances as first-time white authors, especially male authors, whom the top editors related to, right? So it wasn't even, you can't even just say it's about sales. There's something else about power and replicating itself. And either by design or because it's not particularly self-aware. It's hard, I'm not in that room, so I don't know what they're saying. But it's really even not about the market.
Well,
I'm going to end us on a cheesy note here, but rather sometimes it sounds cheesy.
Okay.
But it goes back to, who was it? I don't know. It might be a Joy Harjo quote. That that in the face of all the destruction that's being done, that all we can do is create as hard as we can create, and that whether when I hear you, Ron, talk about Alaska Quarterly Review and literary magazines, it does come back to labors of love. That really is the only way you fight the market. That really is the only way you build community. That's the only way you create followings and everything else. We literally have to fight with love, and that's the only way as well, I think, that we keep ourselves going, year after year, whether it's in the pursuit of making art or telling stories or sharing them or building community. It's to dedicate ourselves, not just against something, but for something.
Absolutely.
And that comes back to love.
And we need to, and the truth.
Yes.
I would talk about that as a very important aspect of why we do what we do. And you have to ask yourself, what is it that we really value as a society? Are these things of immediate gratification, immediate entertainment? See, it's not about what's popular. That's the problem, because what's popular at the moment may not be what's popular later or needed. And the things that have actually stood the test of time haven't necessarily been popular in their own time, because the artist is ahead. The literary artist is telling a truth that is not commonly recognized, nor is it endowed, nor is it often supported.
Or welcomed.
Right? Or welcomed, absolutely, or welcome. And this, having you both together, and this was very intentional because we led our sections, and this issue that you are both in is amazing from beginning to end, honestly. But there was such a strong voice, and there was such a voice that would not be open or valued in many other journals. For example, many people think it's not okay to publish longer pieces. It's simply not okay to do that. Well, who says that a novella or a long piece, ire'ne, your piece is quite long, and the reason why it's great is because it has the space. It has to have the space. Who's to say that it isn't worth it?
Or that people can only consume, in small bits.
That's right.
That's all the attention span anybody has.
Exactly. So there's a dumbing down.
No.
And that's true a little bit in the way things are going, even with education now. There's wish-fulfilling kinds of ways of looking at history because it's unpleasant to look at the truth. So why not change it? Because it makes people uncomfortable, right? Being uncomfortable is where you get to a better place. When you're complacent, you don't do anything. You know, trouble is interesting, but it's also compelling. It makes you move. It makes you find solutions. It gets the brain to do things. In any event, we could go on for a long time, and we do need to end, but I am so grateful to you both that you sent us your pieces. And it's an honor to publish both of you in our pages with longer pieces, I should say, as well, and as compelling pieces, and pieces that are going to make people feel a little uncomfortable. It's not about their comfort level. That's not what it's about. That's not what actually elevates and inspires in the end. Comfort puts you to sleep. It gets you nowhere. It's a way to be dead-ended. And so that is what we're about at Alaska Quarterly. And, I'll end with a pitch for us and for you. Folks should go out and buy your books. Okay, that's one thing. You should put your money down and buy the books. And they should support literary magazines because we do it because it's the foundation, it's the scaffolding. Without it, you have somebody corporate telling you what is good. That's just simply the way, even if they're benevolent, right? They cannot have the vision that's wide enough to incorporate or to include. They just simply can't do it, no matter, the New Yorker can't do it. They're wonderful, but they can't have that breadth. They can't know everything. And so the literary magazines, pick up one in your community. And people should, in fact, consider subscribing to Alaska Quarterly, to look at our YouTube channel, which is free. By the way, if you know anything about AQR, we've kept our prices, they're really kind of irrelevant in a way. We want to keep everything down. We want to give access free. When we redid our website, people said, hey, you got to have a paywall. You need the money. And I said, no walls. No walls. We're going to have people have access to the literature as much as we can to make the pie bigger. And with your bravery and courage, the mark of true artists, by the way, it is a kind of courage to tell the story, to be willing to do it, to make yourself vulnerable, as both of you have done in your work. And so again, that's something that I hope everybody will look to read your pieces in Alaska Quarterly and to buy your books. And it's true with everybody that we publish. We're hoping to make the world bigger for them because we need to invest in the voices. And by the way, one other thing that we believe, if a writer has only one story to tell or a poet one poem and we see it, we do not calculate as a cat might how they can jump to a particular higher counter. We say, this needs to be out there. If this is the only song someone has to sing, and it is beautiful and true and important, it needs to have a venue if we are discerning enough to recognize it. So that's the thing that's really important, I think. That's part of our philosophy. So with that in mind, we'll end this by saying goodbye for now. But again, my gratitude to ire'ne and to Mai-lee and the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center for supporting our series. So until the next time, I hope to see you guys back watching our videos, reading our books, and supporting the writers that we publish. So thank you for now. See you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, ire'ne. Thank you, Alaska Quarterly Review. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. you.